The catastrophic crash in Ahmedabad that took over 260 lives wasn't some random, unpredictable tragedy. It was the latest disaster in a terrifying pattern that has been plaguing India's aviation sector for years. What if I told you that official reports from past incidents held the clues to preventing this one? We have the evidence, and it points to a systemic failure that officials have seemingly ignored. In this video, we're connecting the dots between multiple incidents to uncover the real and deeply unsettling reason for flight accidents in India. On June 12, 2025, Air India Flight 171, a modern Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, took off from Ahmedabad, heading for London. Just seconds after lifting off, it crashed into a medical college, killing 241 of the 242 people on the plane and 19 more on the ground. As the search for answers began, the first clues emerged from India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, or AAIB. The initial findings, based on early analysis, are chilling. They suggest the crash was caused by a sudden fuel cutoff to both engines. This wasn't a slow failure, it was an instantaneous starvation. Evidence for this reportedly comes from the cockpit voice recorder, which is said to have captured a tense, confused exchange between the pilots. According to sources close to the investigation, one pilot asked the other why he had moved the fuel switches to cut off. The other pilot responded that he hadn't. To understand how serious this is, you need to know what these switches do. On a Boeing jet, the fuel cutoff switches are on the center console. Their job is simple and absolute. They stop fuel from getting to the engines. They're designed with protective guards to stop a pilot from ever hitting them by accident. Flipping them from run to cut off mid-air is an action that should never happen, unless there's an uncontrollable engine fire. The data showed that both of Flight 171's switches were moved to cut off within a second of each other, right after takeoff. This shocking finding initially pointed the investigation at the flight crew. But this is where the story gets much bigger than just two pilots. So, the big question is, was the Ahmedabad crash a total fluke, a one-off event? Data obtained through a right-to-information request to the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or DGCA, tells a very different story. The numbers are staggering. Between 2020 and 2025, Indian Airlines reported 65 separate incidents of in-flight engine shutdowns. That's an average of nearly one engine shutdown every single month for 5 years straight. Now, in all 65 of those previous incidents, the pilots did exactly what they were trained for. They safely landed the plane on the one remaining engine. But this perfect record of successful landings may have accidentally hidden a deeper, more dangerous problem. It created a false sense of security, a belief that these failures, while serious, were manageable. The reasons for these shutdowns were well known and documented. Aviation experts and pilot groups consistently pointed to things like blocked fuel filters, water contamination in the fuel, and other maintenance-related issues. These aren't mysteries. They are the exact kinds of technical problems that strict oversight is supposed to prevent. The AAIB's initial report on Ahmedabad, mentioning a fuel cutoff, fits perfectly into this pattern of technical failures that pilots had been dealing with for years, until June 12, when one finally became unmanageable. The warning signs weren't just there, they were happening, on average, once a month. We're about to connect these recurring technical problems to an even bigger systemic issue within the regulatory bodies themselves. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to know what happens next in the investigation, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps our channel keep doing these deep dives. If these technical problems are happening so often, the obvious question is, why isn't anyone stopping them? This is where the story moves from engine parts to the regulators who are supposed to ensure our safety. Shortly after the Ahmedabad disaster, the DGCA conducted a surprise safety audit of major airports, and the findings reported by the media were, to put it mildly, damning. The internal audit found a system suffering from serious neglect. It found cases where defects on planes were reported over and over, meaning the maintenance wasn't fixing the root problem. It found that critical maintenance procedures simply weren't being followed correctly. Even airport infrastructure was a problem, with things like faded runway markings and broken ground equipment. Perhaps most disturbing, the report suggested some maintenance logs might have been ignored or even faked. So, how does this happen? A parliamentary standing committee report gives us a clue, pointing to huge staff shortages across India's aviation agencies. The DGCA, the main watchdog, is reportedly running with a 53% vacancy rate, with over 800 positions unfilled. This has created what insiders call monitoring gaps and forced the agency to be reactive, investigating after a crash instead of proactively preventing one. The committee had warned about this very problem before the crash happened. This creates a picture of a regulator flying blind, struggling to keep up with one of the fastest-growing aviation markets in the world. And here's the great paradox. The International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, recently audited India and gave it an impressive safety score of over 85%, ranking it above the global average and even higher than countries like the United States and China in some areas. How can a system have such a high safety rating on paper, while its own internal audits reveal a culture of recurring defects and ignored maintenance on the ground? The 65 engine shutdowns tell a story of a dangerous gap between official scores and the reality in the air. Alright, let's connect all the dots. We have a documented history of frequent engine shutdowns caused by known fuel and maintenance problems. We have a regulator that looks great in international audits but is critically understaffed and, by its own admission, is finding that essential safety procedures are being ignored. And then we have the crash of Air India 171. When you look at it this way, the Ahmedabad tragedy stops looking like a random accident. It starts to look like the catastrophic result of a known risk that the system simply failed to manage. The question of what happened in the cockpit becomes far more complicated. While initial reports focus on the fuel cutoff switches, we have to ask what could lead to such a drastic action in the first place. Was it a deliberate act? Or was it a confused, panicked response to the very type of technical emergency that had been happening for years? This is where a critical piece of evidence comes in. Investigators noted a U.S. Federal Aviation Administration advisory from all the way back in 2018. It warned about a potential design flaw in the locking mechanism of the fuel control switches on some Boeing aircraft. According to reports, Air India told investigators that fixing this wasn't mandatory, so no specific inspection was ever done. This single point raises the stunning possibility that a known documented weakness could have played a role. Suddenly, those final moments, the reported confusion in the cockpit and the desperate Mayday call, exist in a whole new context. A context of systemic weakness, recurring technical failures, and past warnings that were never acted on. So, the real cause of the Air India Flight 171 crash isn't just about two switches in a cockpit. It's about a system that, honestly, allowed the same kind of technical failure to happen 65 times. Creating this dangerous sense that the risk was somehow normal. It's about a regulator that, even though it gets good scores on paper, is just way too understaffed to really police the industry it oversees. This tragedy wasn't just some isolated incident. It was the predictable, heartbreaking outcome of a system where, honestly, the warning lights had been flashing for years. There are still, so many questions that remain unanswered. We still don't know the full story of what actually happened between those two pilots in the final terrifying seconds. Was it a desperate, maybe flawed reaction to a problem we've seen happen again and again? Or, well, was it something else? And the biggest question of all, will this catastrophic loss of life finally force a real change in India's aviation safety culture? Our deepest condolences go out to the victims of this tragedy and, of course, their families, who are now left waiting for answers and accountability. The investigation is far from over, and honestly, we'll be following the final report very closely. So, if you want to stay updated, subscribe and turn on notifications for our follow-up analysis. Based on the evidence so far, what are your theories? Let us know in the comments.